I now have Blender open, and it may look a little bit different at first. That's because I am using a couple add-ons that are changing things around. Firstly, for my UI, I get all these pie menus from the add-on Heavy Poly Blender config, which basically just kind of changes some UI elements around so it's easier for modeling. And then in addition to that, there's a couple other add-ons that are very important that I will be using throughout this course. There are 3 specifically I'm just going to go over now because I'm going to be using them constantly. The first one is HardOps. Basically, HardOps lets you take a cube, right, and give you all, or rather any mesh, but in this example cube, and gives you all sorts of functionalities. So with HardOps, for instance, we can instantly do bevels from one key binding, which is the Q key, pulls up a HardOps menu. We can do things, arrays, and then we even can do things like change sharpening from here too. We can resharp, so we can get this smooth by angle modifier instantly put into the mesh without having to go into our modifier section. So I highly recommend HardOps just for putting a lot of tools that you use often in Blender all in one little menu that you can pull up with the Q key. Another very important one is Quick Snap, where basically you can just snap an object from a vertice to a vertice without having to change pivots. So for instance, I have a cube, and then I have another cube, just duplicated in this case, and then I will press the E key on my keyboard, which I bound to Quick Snap. It actually wants me to update it, which I'm going to ignore for now. But basically, with this open, I can just go in and select any vert, click it, and then drag, and it will snap to any other vert on another model. So this is very useful for quickly snapping to get proper orientations and exact alignments between your meshes. Now, the last thing is there's a tool I use a lot, which is Pivot Transform. So imagine if I have my cube up here, right, and I want to get the pivot to the bottom, I can just click on the Shift, Alt, and A keys, and then I bring up a pivot menu. I can do things like I can pull a pivot to a bottom of the mesh automatically. I can go into a transform, and then I can basically move the pivot very easily and then rotate from anywhere, right? And then I also have the option to do a flow system. So for instance, if I have rotation, if I rotate an asset, I freeze the transforms and I no longer have access to local rotation, right? So I'll set the rotation to local and it's following world because I froze the transforms. I can basically use the Pivot Transform plugin just to go into flow and automatically map the orientation of the mesh's coordinates to a surface normal. And then now when I move in a local axis, I have access to coordinates that naturally follow my shape. So these are all important plugins that are quite useful. Before I get deep into modeling at the blockout, I am going to just go over one of the things that I'm going to be doing a lot of, which is converting curves into meshes and vice versa. So imagine I want to import some curves. In this case, I want to import the phi scale I modeled earlier. I'm going to go into Import, File, Import, and then go into SVG. So I imported the phi scale, and it will import very tiny because when you're going from a lot of these programs into Blender, your scale gets messed up. So I'm just going to have to select everything here, and I'm going to scale up, just get this guy a lot larger. And basically the same lines I drew in Rhino, I now have in Blender, and any program that can export SVGs can do this for you. And then once it's in here, they are curves. So what I will often do is I will use the phi scale in Blender modeling just to check proportioning. And then if I don't want to have lines, which are kind of hard to see, maybe it's ideal to use instead geometry, where you can just go down into the curve section, geometry, and then change the depth on your rounds. And the coordinates are going to be a little bit weird because I haven't set up a scale. So your numbers might be kind of small, but I have this option. And then if I select these different curves, I can join them with the first curve and it will inherit the same roundness from this little bevel option here. And then what's cool is once I have this in place, I can just right click, convert to mesh, and now this is all polygons where I can do further operations on. And then additionally, if I, need this to go back into curve mode, I'll just maybe grab one of these vertices. Maybe I just want to grab one line here. I will pull that out of the mesh, and then I get an edge, and then I convert this edge into a curve going through the same method, but just now reversed. And then now it is a curve again. And then when it's in curve format, I can even take this back, import it back into Rhino or Adobe Illustrator, any other program that can deal with curves. And then I can further modify it there. So I imagine I have this cube here and I want to proportion this guy. Maybe it's a piece of architecture I'm starting, or a piece of architecture I want to turn this cube into. Now, what I might do first is set the pivot to the bottom with the pivot transform add-on, scale this guy up a bit. I can set it to the ground plane by just making this selection go to my 3D cursor, which is at the 0 point. And then from here, I might have my curves, and I want the pivot to be on this point. So I'll just select it, do my pivot transform add-on again, and then set the pivot to selection, which is a selected vertice. And then from there, I can set my rotation and then rotate this up. And then I can begin to, I need to actually, if I'm going to snap this, I need to make sure that if I'm snapping it with the default method, at least I need to make sure that the snap base is center, and then also set to vertice instead of grid increment. And then when I hold down control and moving, I will be able to snap to the bottom of this cube. And then I can begin to find my proportions, right? So I might line up this cube here, and then maybe that gives me an area I want to extrude. So if I go into a right view, orthographic, I can then use snapping to kind of snap to these coordinate points on the phi scale. And then basically I know that this extrusion I made is in proportion to the rest of the cube, which would be on, what would this be? If we know that this top one is phi squared, then we would basically say that I think this cube would additionally, I think that would line up with this would be, so the cube part would be phi squared, and then the part extending out under it would be a phi cubed condition. So these guys are in proportion to each other. And then what if I wanted the top to basically then be another point of the top of this scale, be another point from which I want to measure from, and I don't want to change my pivot? Well, I can use the pivot, the easy snap tool, to basically move this point without a pivot. So I can basically snap it to from any point to any point in the cube to very quickly get perfect snaps to check scale and to check proportion and all of that. So using the quick snap tool is a very quick way to basically check proportions when you have a phi scale as curves in your scene. Another cool thing that I can do is if I want to check the overall volume of a shape to see if it falls into the golden ratio, maybe I don't have a phi scale on hand, then there's a quick way to do this. And I do this a lot in different video game engines where maybe you haven't imported a scale into the game engine yet, and you want to check proportions. A really easy way to do so is if I have a cube, right? I know that a cube is basically at least a square on one side. So I can scale the cube, lock it to one axis, in this case the Y, and I can type in 1.618 on the keyboard. Now, because we know that the phi proportion is an irrational number, by typing in 1.618 into the keyboard when you're scaling an object, you're not going to get a perfect division, but you're going to get pretty close, which is really all you need most of the time. So then I'll click enter, and now I have a golden rectangle as a box, right? And then if we check this guy, we should be able to duplicate this again, and we can actually go in the opposite direction. If I then take the same object and then scale it again in one axis by 0.618, and then put this guy into place, and then scale it, you're going to see, like, look at this. I'm pretty close to having shapes that are matching the divisions of the phi scale, and I didn't measure anything perfectly. I just took a box and I scaled it. So anytime that you have access to non-uniform scaling tools, you can basically turn any shape, you can put any shape into proportion just by basically dividing by or scaling by 0.618 to go smaller, or scaling by 1.618 to go larger, and then basically keep those lines in proportion.